The house smelled of beeswax and old paper, and somewhere beneath that, faintly, of the lavender water the housekeeper sprinkled on the linens twice a week. Iris Hartley had learned to love that smell in the 3 months she had worked at Fernwell. It meant she had arrived. It meant, for a few hours at least, she did not have to think about the leaking roof at home, or her mother's cough, or the small brown ledger where the numbers never seemed to add up in her favor. She let herself in through the side door as she always did, and hung her cloak on the third peg, the one nearest the kitchen, because the first two belonged to the housekeeper and the cook and no one had ever told her so. She had simply understood it. The kettle was already humming on the hob. Mrs. Pruitt, the housekeeper, looked up from the bread she was kneading and nodded toward the study. "He's been asking for you since 9:30, she said. "Restless this morning. There's a new letter come. Sealed with the Duke's own crest, if you please. Sitting on his desk like a coal that might burn him." Iris felt the small flutter she always felt when a letter from the Duke of Ashcombe arrived. Not because she cared for dukes. She had never met one and did not expect to. But because these letters, more than any others, seemed to matter to the old man in a way that made her chest ache a little each time she read them aloud. She crossed the hall and knocked twice on the study door before letting herself in. Mr. Josiah Wren sat in his usual chair by the window, though the window did him no good at all, since he had not seen daylight in 11 years. He was a tall man still, though age and blindness had folded him inward somewhat, the way a letter folds along an old crease. His hair was white and combed back from a high forehead. His eyes, pale and clouded, moved toward the sound of the door out of old habit, though they found nothing. "Miss Hartley," he said, and his voice warmed at once, the way it always did. "I heard the gate. You are prompt as ever." "I try to be, sir." She crossed the room, her boots quiet on the old carpet, and took her place in the chair across from him, the small writing table between them where the day's correspondence waited. "Mrs. Pruitt tells me there is a letter from the Duke." Something moved behind the old man's clouded eyes. She had learned to read these small movements, since his face could not do what other faces did. A tightening at the corner of his mouth. A stillness in his hands, which had been resting, restless, on the arms of his chair, and now went quiet. "Read it to me," he said. "Read it slowly. I would like to hear every word twice if you have the patience for it." "I always have the patience for it, sir." She broke the seal. A heavy wax disc pressed with a crest she had seen a dozen times now and never once thought to ask about, because it was not her place, and because the old man never explained it, and because some part of her understood that questions in this house were like doors best left closed, and drew out 2 sheets of fine paper closely written. "My dear father," she began, and her voice, low and clear, filled the small warm room. "I write to you from Ashcombe, where the harvest has come in better than we feared, though the west fields flooded again in the spring and I have set men to the drainage at last. A matter I know you told me to see to 5 years ago and which I am ashamed to say I only now understand the wisdom of." Josiah Wren's mouth curved, just slightly at that. "He never did listen to me about the west fields," he murmured. "Go on. I think of you more than my letters likely show, and I know that is a poor way to prove it, since a man who thinks of someone ought to write oftener than I do. I have no excuse but the estate, and the endless business of it, and a certain restlessness in myself that I cannot account for. I am well provided for in every way a man is meant to be well provided for, and yet I find myself, some evenings, standing at the window of a room too large for one man, wondering what I have actually built." Iris paused. She had read a great many letters from a great many correspondents in her short career as a reader, invitations, accounts, the dull business letters of solicitors, but she had never grown used to the particular ache of reading a stranger's private thoughts aloud to his father, knowing the stranger had likely never meant for a third person's voice to carry them. She glanced up. Josiah's face had gone very still, the way it did each time. "Shall I continue, sir? Please. You will forgive me for saying too much," the letter went on. "There are things I would tell you if I could sit across from you as I did when I was a boy, rather than send them across 60 miles of road in a stranger's hand. I miss the sound of your voice explaining things to me. I find that no one explains things to a duke. They only agree with him, which is a very lonely sort of conversation to have for the rest of one's life. Your son, Alaric." The room was quiet after she finished. Outside, a blackbird was singing in the hedge, and somewhere in the house a door closed softly. Josiah Wren sat with his hands folded now, very still, and Iris waited, because she had learned that he needed a moment after his son's letters, the way a man needs a moment after climbing a long stair. "He was a serious child," Josiah said at last, "even as a boy, always watching the servants at their work as though he meant to learn every one of their trades himself. I used to tell his mother he would make either an excellent duke or a very poor one, and that there would be no middle way with him." He turned his clouded eyes toward her, though they found nothing, as they always found nothing. "You read his letters very well, Miss Hartley. Better than the vicar's daughter did before you came." She read them as though she were reading a shopping list. "I try to hear what he means, sir, not only what he says." "Yes," Josiah said softly. "I had noticed that. She did not know, could not have known, that in the small adjoining room, the one Mrs. Pruitt called the morning room, though it caught no morning sun at all and was used mostly for storing account books, a man stood very still against the wall beside the connecting door, which had been left open a careless inch, and had not moved in the better part of 10 minutes. He was young, not much past 30, dressed plainly in a grey coat with none of the ornament a man of his actual rank might have worn, and his jaw was set in the particular way of a man holding his breath without quite meaning to. He had heard his own letter read back to him in a stranger's voice, and something in him had gone soft and unguarded in a manner he did not often permit. His name, to the household of Fernwell, was Mr. Grey. A family friend, they had been told, a gentleman who had once done business with Josiah Wren in his sighted days and now called upon him out of old loyalty, 3 or 4 times a month, always quietly, always without ceremony. He came in a plain caracal. He wore no signet ring. He gave his hat to no footman because Fernwell kept none. He sat with the old man over cribbage and brandy and asked after his health and his garden, and never once, in the 8 months he had been coming, mentioned the word Duke. His name, to the rest of England, was Alaric Voss, Duke of Ashcombe. And the letter Iris Hartley had just finished reading, the letter about the West Fields and the restlessness and the window of a room too large for one man. He had written himself 6 days ago at his own desk in his own hand and sent by his own secretary, because he could not yet bring himself to say such things to his father's face. It was easier, somehow, to put them on paper and let them travel 60 miles and arrive as ink rather than as his own voice, trembling, in his father's own study. He had not expected, when he slipped into the morning room that morning to wait quietly for his usual visit, that the reading would already be underway. He had not expected to hear his own private confession spoken aloud in a voice he did not recognize, low, warm, unhurried, careful with the pauses in a way that told him, even before he could see her, that whoever was reading understood exactly what the words cost him. He had meant to clear his throat. He had meant to make his presence known, as he always did, with a polite knock and an easy greeting. Instead he had stood very still against the wall, listening to a stranger read his heart back to him, and felt something in his chest crack open a little, the way old wood cracks in a sudden frost. By the time he finally stepped through the connecting door, his face was composed again, arranged into the easy half-smile of Mr. Grey, family friend, no one of consequence. "Am I too early?" he asked, and Josiah's face lit at once, the way it always did. "Grey. No, no, sit. Miss Hartley has just been reading me a letter from my son." "Has she?" He crossed the room and took the second chair, the one that had been placed there for him so many times now that Mrs. Pruitt no longer bothered to ask if he required it. His eyes went, briefly, to the young woman across the small writing table, and it was the first time, in truth, that he had looked at her properly rather than only listened. She was perhaps 22. Her hair was a plain brown, pinned back without fuss, a few strands loosened by the morning's walk. Her dress was neat but worn at the cuffs in the particular way of a woman who mended her own clothes and mended them well. Her eyes, when they lifted to his, were a clear hazel, direct without being bold, and there was ink on the side of her third finger, a small dark smudge she had clearly tried and failed to scrub away. "Mr. Grey," she said, with a small polite nod, the nod of a woman who has been introduced to a gentleman perhaps a dozen times now and has settled into a comfortable, unremarkable acquaintance with him. "You've a good ear for timing. We've just this moment finished." "I seem to have that gift," he said. "What sort of man is the Duke, from his letters?" "I confess I have never had the pleasure of meeting him." He watched her consider the question seriously, rather than laugh it off as most young women might have. "Lonely, I think," she said at last. "He writes like a man with a great deal to say and no one left to say it to. He apologizes too much for a man of his rank. Most men who hold that much power do not think to apologize at all." She glanced toward Josiah, softening. "But he loves his father. That much is plain in every line, however he dresses it up in talk of drainage and harvests." Alaric Voss sat very still with his hands folded in his lap, and said nothing, because there was nothing he trusted himself to say. The pattern of the days did not change greatly after that, though something in the room had shifted, quietly, like furniture moved an inch from its accustomed place. Enough to notice, not enough to name. Iris came each morning at 10 and read to Josiah Wren until noon. Correspondence first, when there was any, then the newspaper, then whatever novel they were partway through, which that season was a long, improbable tale of shipwrecks and inheritances that Josiah pretended to find tedious and secretly adored. Mr. Grey came perhaps twice a week now instead of once, though he gave no reason for the change, and no one asked him for one. He would arrive in the late morning, just as the reading was finishing, and stay through luncheon and often longer. He had taken, in recent weeks, to arriving early enough to hear the last quarter hour of whatever Iris was reading, standing in the doorway rather than announcing himself, until Josiah's ear, sharper than most men's, since it had been doing the work of 2 senses for 11 years, caught the sound of his boots on the hall floor and called him in. "You do that on purpose," Iris said to him one afternoon, folding the newspaper closed as he came through the door for what she guessed was the 4th time that fortnight. lingering rather than announced. Loitering in the hall like a footman waiting to be noticed. I like the sound of a story I've come in partway through, he said. It makes a man attend more carefully, wondering what he's missed. That is either very flattering or very strange, Mr. Gray, and I have not decided which. Both, I should think, he said, and something in his face, some small honest thing, made her laugh before she had quite decided to. He found that he looked forward to those mornings in a way he had not looked forward to anything in some years. Not merely for his father's sake, though he loved his father with a fierce, guarded love that had only grown more tender since the blindness came, but for the small quarter hours before Josiah called him in, when he stood in the doorway and listened to Iris Hartley's voice moving through whatever words the day had given her, patient with his father's slow questions, gentle with his father's occasional confusion, sharp and quick whenever Josiah tried, as he sometimes did, to test her with a difficult word or an old joke. She did not flatter the old man. She corrected him when he misremembered a date. She teased him, gently, when he grew maudlin over old griefs, in a way that made him laugh instead of weep, which Alaric suspected no one else in the household dared to do. And she read his own letters, the letters he wrote as the Duke and sent as a stranger might send them, with a care that made him ashamed some days of how little courage it took to write a thing down compared to how much it took to say it aloud. He told himself, at first, that he called on Josiah more often simply because his father was growing older, and the visits mattered more than they once had. He told himself this for perhaps 6 weeks before he stopped believing it. Somewhere around the afternoon Iris Hartley looked up from the page she was reading, caught him watching her rather than his father, and did not look away at once. Held his gaze instead, curious, faintly amused, as though she had noticed something in him and filed it away to consider later, the way she seemed to file away everything. He was in a great deal of trouble, he understood then, and had no idea at all what to do about it. It was Mrs. Pruitt who first mentioned the cousin, one wet afternoon while Iris waited in the kitchen for the rain to ease before her walk home. Mr. Edmund Wren, the housekeeper said, setting a cup of tea in front of Iris with more force than the gesture strictly required. The master's nephew came calling again last week while you were away visiting your mother. Sat in the study a full hour asking the master about his accounts, his health, whether he found the stairs difficult, whether he'd thought of moving somewhere smaller and easier managed. She sniffed. Smaller and easier managed. As if Fernwell were a burden to the man rather than the only home he's had since his sight went. Does the old man not care for him? Care for him well enough, I dare say, being blood. But there's a hunger in that young man's questions that has nothing to do with love, Miss Hartley, and I've been in service long enough to know the sound of it. He asks after the will. He asks after the physician's opinion of the master's mind, whether it wanders, whether he forgets things. Mrs. Pruitt lowered her voice, though there was no one else in the kitchen to hear it. There's talk among the other servants at his own house, mind, not ours, of a physician's letter, a certificate, the sort of thing a man gets drawn up when he means to have an old relation declared not fit to manage his own affairs. Iris felt something cold settle in her stomach. Surely the Duke would not allow such a thing to be done to his own father. The Duke, said Mrs. Pruitt, with the particular flatness of a woman repeating an old grievance, is 60 miles off managing an estate the size of a small country, Miss Hartley, and has not set foot in this house in the better part of 2 years, however fine his letters read. Whatever protection Mr. Wren has, it will not come riding in from Ashcombe in time if that nephew moves quick and quiet, which is exactly his way of moving. That evening, walking the mile and a half home in the last gray light, Iris found she could not stop thinking of it. Of Josiah Wren's clouded, trusting eyes, of the particular vulnerability of a blind man whose family did not visit him, and of the strange, gentle Mr. Gray who came so often and sat so patiently, and yet, she now realized with a small unease, had never once mentioned what he might do, or whom he might tell, if harm came to his old friend. She did not yet know that the man she meant to warn was, in fact, the very Duke Mrs. Pruitt believed too distant to help, that he had heard every word of the conversation from the hall, where he had arrived, as he so often did now, a quarter hour early, and stood listening at the door. She did not yet know that he had gone very pale, and very still, and that his hand, resting on the frame of the door, had closed slowly into a fist. He did not go in to see his father that day. He stood in the hall a long while after Mrs. Pruitt's voice had fallen silent and Iris's footsteps had faded down the corridor toward the side door, and he found that his hands, when he looked down at them, were not entirely steady. Edmund. Of course it was Edmund. He had never trusted the man, not since they were boys, when Edmund had been the sort of child who counted another child's toys with a covetous, assessing eye rather than a friendly one. He had simply not imagined that his cousin's hunger would turn, so soon, so openly, toward his father, because he had believed, in the comfortable, distant way a busy man believes such things, that his absence from Fernwell was a kindness, a way of letting his father live free of the fuss and formality that followed a duke everywhere he went. He saw now that his absence had not been a kindness at all. It had been a door left open. He rode back to the inn where he kept rooms under the name Gray, and he did not sleep well that night, and in the morning he wrote 3 letters. One to his solicitor in London, instructing a full and immediate review of his father's affairs and the appointment of a second physician, of unimpeachable character, to examine Josiah Wren's mind and give sworn testimony to its soundness. One to the magistrate of the county, a man he had known at Oxford, asking quietly whether any petition regarding the elder Mr. Wren's competency had been filed or discussed, and one which he wrote and tore up 4 times before he managed to finish it, to his father, a real letter this time, not one meant to be read aloud by a stranger's gentle voice, but one he meant to deliver himself in his own person, as the man he actually was. He did not send that last one. He carried it, instead, folded twice, in the inner pocket of his coat, and rode to Fernwell that same afternoon with every intention of finally putting it into his father's hands and telling him, at last, the truth he had been too much of a coward to tell him for 8 months. He arrived to find Iris Hartley standing in the front hall, her bonnet already tied, her cloak over her arm, her face pale and set in a way he had not seen it before. "Mr. Gray." She said his name with more urgency than she usually allowed herself. "I am glad you've come. I must speak with you, if you can spare a quarter hour, on a matter I think concerns your friend a great deal." He followed her into the small morning room, the very room where he had so often stood listening, and shut the door behind them, and she told him everything Mrs. Pruitt had told her, her voice low and quick, her hands twisting the ribbon of her bonnet without seeming to notice she was doing it. "I do not know the Duke," she finished, "and I have no right to write to him, and no notion whether he would even trouble to read a letter from his father's paid companion. But I hoped that you, being his father's old friend, might have some way of reaching him. Someone must warn him what his cousin intends before it is done and cannot be undone." Alaric Voss looked at her for a long moment. The folded letter sat heavy in his coat, close enough to his heart that he could feel the crease of it against his ribs. "I can reach him," he said at last carefully. "I promise you that. Whatever must be done to protect your friend, it will be done, and quickly. You have my word on it." "You give your word very easily for a man who is only a friend of the family," she said, and there was something in her eyes now. Not suspicion exactly, but a sharpening, a noticing, the same look she had turned on him weeks ago when she had caught him watching her and not looked away. "I give it easily," he said, "because I mean to keep it." She studied him a moment longer, and he thought, he was almost certain, that something moved behind her eyes, some question forming that she did not yet have the shape of. But she only nodded slowly and said, "Then I will trust you, Mr. Gray," and the way she said his false name struck him harder than any accusation could have. The weeks that followed were the busiest of his life, and the strangest because he lived them in 2 persons at once. As the Duke of Ashcombe, he moved swiftly and without mercy. His solicitor descended upon Edmund Wren's own solicitor with a precision that left the younger man's scheme in ruins within a fortnight. The physician's certificate, which had, indeed, existed, procured from a man of poor reputation and poorer scruples, declared worthless by 2 better physicians and a magistrate who owed the Ashcombe name a great many favors. Edmund himself received a visit from the Duke's own steward, a conversation of which no record survived except the fact that Edmund Wren did not call at Fernwell again, and was heard, some months later, to have taken a position abroad. As Mr. Gray, he continued to arrive twice a week, still early enough to catch the last of the morning's reading, still lingering in the doorway to listen before Josiah called him in. He told his father nothing of what he had done, not directly, though he watched with a fierce, quiet satisfaction as the old man's worry, a worry Josiah had tried to hide, in the way blind men hide things, by simply speaking of other matters more often, eased week by week, until one morning Josiah remarked over cribbage that he had heard nothing from his nephew in some time and found he did not miss the sound of the man's questions. "Perhaps he has found some other old relation to trouble," Alaric said lightly, and did not meet Iris's eyes, and did not see the small, thoughtful frown that crossed her face at the careless certainty in his voice, the certainty of a man who knew, rather than hoped, that the trouble was over. It was the letters that finally undid him. 2 more had come from Ashcombe in that time, written honestly, in his own hand, sent as they always were through his secretary, so that no one at Fernwell would ever connect the Duke's correspondence with the quiet gentleman who visited on Tuesdays and Fridays. He had grown careless in the writing of them, or perhaps simply more honest, because there was a particular freedom in confessing his heart to paper when he could not see his father's face receive it, and lately his letters had begun, without his quite intending it, to speak less of harvests and more of a certain reader with ink on her finger and a laugh that came out of her sideways, as though she had not meant to allow it. "There is a young woman who reads to father now," he had written, 6 days before the afternoon that follows, "and I confess, father, that I have taken to arranging my visits around the hour of her reading rather than your convenience, which is a poor way to treat an old man, and I am ashamed of it, and I have no intention whatsoever of changing my habits. I do not know what to do with the way I feel when she looks up from the page. I am a duke, and dukes are not meant to be undone by a woman with ink-stained fingers and a talent for cribbage. I find I do not care." He had not imagined, when he wrote it, that Iris herself would be the one to read it aloud. She had no warning of what the letter contained. How could she? And so her voice moved through the opening lines in its usual unhurried, careful way, warm with the particular tenderness she always brought to the Duke's correspondence, until she reached the 3rd paragraph in her own name, unwritten but unmistakable, rose up out of the page toward her like water closing over her head. She stopped. The room went very quiet. Josiah, sensing the silence rather than understanding it, tilted his head. Miss Hartley? Her voice was not quite steady. She looked up and found Mr. Gray standing in the doorway where he always stood, and something in his face. A stillness, a nakedness, the look of a man who has just realized the trap he built is closed on his own foot. Told her, before her mind had finished the thought, exactly what her mind had been circling toward for weeks without daring to land. The voice in the letters. The care in every word. I have taken to arranging my visits around the hour of her reading. The way he always arrived early enough to catch the last of a page. The way his certainty about Edmund Wren's silence had been the certainty of a man who had ended the matter himself, not merely hoped it ended. You, she said slowly, and the paper trembled very slightly in her hand. It is you. You are, Iris. He said her given name for the first time in 8 months of careful acquaintance, and it came out low and urgent, a man trying to catch something before it fell. Let me explain. You are the Duke. She said it flatly, without heat, which was somehow worse than if she had shouted it. You have sat in that chair for 8 months and called yourself Mr. Gray and let me read you your own letters as though you were only some friend of the family, and you let me. She stopped herself. Her face had gone very pale, and very still, in a way that reminded him, absurdly, of his father's stillness when a letter cut too close to something private. You let me believe a great many things that were not true. I never lied about what I felt, he said quietly. Only about my name. That is the whole of a lie, sir. A name is not a small thing to withhold from a person for 8 months. Josiah, in his chair, had gone very still himself, his blind eyes moving between the sound of his son's voice and the sound of Iris's, understanding, in the particular sharp way of a man who has learned to hear what a room contains rather than see it, that something enormous had just happened in front of him. Alaric, he said slowly, is that you, boy? Is it truly you? The Duke crossed the room in 3 strides and knelt beside his father's chair and took the old man's hand in both of his, and for a moment the weight of everything he had been carrying, the 2 names, the 2 lives, the letters written to be heard by a stranger's voice, seemed to break open at once. It's me, father. It has been me. I did not know how to walk in here as the Duke and sit with you the way I used to sit with you as a boy. Every time I tried, I felt the title standing between us like a wall, and I could not bear it, and so I found a smaller door and came through that instead. I am sorry. I should have told you the day I first came. Josiah's clouded eyes filled slowly, and his hand tightened on his son's. You foolish, foolish boy, he said, and his voice was thick. You needn't have hidden from me. I would have known you anywhere, title or no title. I very nearly did know you, more than once, only I told myself an old blind man's fancies were not to be trusted. Iris stood very still by the writing table, the letter still in her hand, watching father and son with an ache in her chest she did not entirely understand, grief and tenderness and a raw, unresolved anger all tangled together, until the Duke rose at last and turned to her, and the easy, borrowed manner of Mr. Gray was entirely gone from his face, leaving only Alaric Voss, uncertain and plainly frightened in a way she suspected very few people had ever seen him. I would ask you to forgive me, he said, but I do not think I have earned the asking yet. I will only tell you the truth of it, all of it, and let you decide what to do with a man who told you everything except the one thing that mattered. Then tell me, she said. He told her. He told her of the 7 years of ballrooms and painted smiles that had made him distrust every voice raised in his direction, of the loneliness of a title that answered every question with agreement and never once with honesty, of a father grown blind and distant whom he had not known how to love properly except through the safe distance of paper and a false name. He told her that he had come to Fernwell first for his father's sake and stayed, in time, for reasons that had nothing to do with his father at all, for the sound of her voice moving through a room, for the small ink stain on her finger, for the particular way she corrected his father's memory without ever once making the old man feel corrected. I did not set out to deceive you, he said. I set out to hide from my own name and you were simply there, kind to an old man. Honest in a way no one is honest with a Duke. I told myself, for a long time, that it did not matter what I called myself in your hearing, because Mr. Gray and Alaric Voss were the same man wearing 2 coats. I understand now that it mattered a very great deal. I am sorry, Iris. I am more sorry than I know how to say in a room, having spent 8 months proving to you that I say things better on paper. She was quiet for a long moment, the letter still trembling faintly in her hand, and when she spoke her voice was low and careful, the voice of a woman weighing something heavy. You let me warn a friend of the family about a scheme against his father, she said, when the whole time it was your own father and your own scheme to end. You let me believe I had done some small good in the world by speaking to a kind stranger, when in truth I had only ever been speaking to the one man with the power to fix it in an afternoon. You did do good, he said. You did more good than my solicitor and my magistrate and every letter I wrote combined, because none of them would have known to look. I did not know to look, Iris. I had made myself so distant from this house that I very nearly lost my father to my own cousin's greed. And it was you, your voice in that kitchen, choosing to trust a stranger with a warning, that saved him. Whatever coat I wore while it happened does not change whose voice it was that mattered. She looked at him a long while. Josiah, in his chair, had gone very still and quiet, listening with the particular attentiveness of a blind man who understands he is present at something he ought not to interrupt. "I do not know what to do with you, Your Grace," Iris said finally, and the title came out of her strangely, testing the shape of it. "You do not have to call me that," he said. "Not here. Not ever if you would rather not. I would be glad to remain simply a man who once wore a gray coat and lied to you about his name, if that is easier for you to forgive. It is not the coat I mind," she said slowly. "It is the 8 months of not knowing which coat was true." "They were both true," he said. "That is the only honest answer I have. I was Mr. Gray in this room because I did not know how to be the Duke and your friend at once. I did not think a Duke was allowed such a small, ordinary thing as friendship, until you gave it to a man in a plain gray coat and never once asked what he was worth." Something in her face softened very slightly at that. A crack in the careful stillness she had been holding. "Give me time," she said at last. "You have had 8 months to decide who you wish to be in this room. I have had 1/4 hour. Take whatever time you need," he said. "I have learned, this last month, that the things worth having are not worth rushing." She took a fortnight. She came each morning as she always had, and read to Josiah Wren as she always had, and was courteous and careful with the Duke on the 2 days he came to call, and said little else, and he did not press her, because he had promised himself he would not make the same mistake twice of taking what was not freely given. It was Josiah, in the end, who forced the matter in his own quiet way, on a wet afternoon when the reading was finished and the Duke had not yet arrived and the old man turned his clouded eyes toward the sound of Iris gathering the day's papers. "You are angry with my son," he said. "You needn't pretend otherwise on my account. I have ears, Miss Hartley, whatever else I've lost. I am not angry, sir, only careful. Careful is a fine word for it." Josiah's mouth curved, the ghost of the smile she had come to know so well. "May I tell you something about my son that he would not think to tell you himself? When he was 9 years old, his mother died, and I watched that boy learn, in the space of a single winter, that the safest thing a person in his position could do was to give away as little of himself as possible, because everyone who wanted something from him, and there were a great many even then, could only take what he offered freely. He built a very small door into himself, Miss Hartley, and he has spent 20 years letting almost no one through it. I have watched him walk through that door himself, of his own will, every single time he has come into this room in a gray coat, to sit with a blind old man and a companion he had no obligation whatsoever to charm. He reached out, unerring, and found her hand where it rested on the writing table, and pressed it once, gently. I do not know what he is worth to you, my dear, but I have known that boy his whole life, and I have never once seen him give so much of himself away, freely to anyone, as he has given to you in this room without you even knowing his name. Iris sat very still for a long moment, her throat tight, and outside the window the rain had begun to ease, the last drops falling slow and silver from the eaves. He is late today, she said at last, unsteadily. He will not be late tomorrow, Josiah said. I have never known that boy to miss a chance twice. He did not miss it. He arrived the next morning at 9:30, earlier than he had ever come, and found her waiting for him not in the study but in the front hall, her cloak already over her arm as though she had been standing there some while, working up the courage for whatever she meant to say. Your Grace, she said, and this time there was no test in the title, only a kind of gentle surrender. Iris, I have decided, she said, that I do not much care which coat you were wearing, so long as you do not ask me to spend the rest of my life pretending I do not know the difference between the two men, because I find, having thought on it a great deal these past 2 weeks, that I love them both and see no reason to choose. He crossed the small space between them in 2 strides, the same way he had crossed the room to his father, and took her hand, the one with the small permanent shadow of ink at the 3rd finger, and held it as though it were the most valuable thing that had ever been placed in his keeping. Then you shall never have to choose, he said. I intend to spend a very long time proving to you that the gray coat and the title were never 2 different men at all, only one man who took a very long time learning how to be both of them honestly in front of the person he loved. Somewhere behind them, in the study, Josiah Wren sat listening to the particular quality of the silence in the hall. A silence he had learned, in 11 years of blindness, to recognize as one thing above all others, and allowed himself, at last, a long and thoroughly satisfied smile. They were married that autumn, in the small stone church nearest Fernwell rather than the grand chapel at Ashcombe, because Iris had asked for it and Alaric had refused her nothing since the day in the hall, and because Josiah Wren, though he could not see the walls of either church, said he preferred the sound of the smaller one, the way the organ filled every corner of it rather than losing itself in vast stone distances. Iris still read to her father-in-law most mornings, though the letters between them had grown unnecessary, since the Duke now lived close enough to visit in person nearly every day, in whichever coat he pleased. She kept, in a drawer of her writing desk at Ashcombe, the very first letter she had ever read aloud in that small warm study, the one about the West Fields and the restlessness in the window of a room too large for one man, because it seemed to her, on quiet evenings, the truest thing he had ever written, and because the room, these days, was no longer too large for one man at all. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. If this moved you, please like, share, and subscribe. Your support keeps these stories alive.